And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Marine forecast for Friday here. Gale warnings on the south coast, south winds 35 knots, and east to southeast winds 30 to 35 knots for the north coast. Lynn Canal north of 25, southeast 25 for Stevens Passage. And gale warnings for Clarence Strait for southeast winds at 45 knots with 14-foot seas. And then for Saturday, much lighter winds here over the inside waters, southeast 15, all areas there. South coast, southeast winds 15 to 20 knots, and east-southeast 20 to 30 knots for the north coast. Prince William Sound, north winds at 20 knots, and north to northeast winds 25 to 30 knots for the eastern North Gulf Coast, north at 25 for the west side, and for the for the Barren Islands, northwest winds 35 knots, northwest at 30. For Kamishak Bay and Cook Inlet, north winds 15 to 25. Saturday, Cook Inlet, north at 15, 25 out of the northwest for Kamishak Bay, north 25 for the Barren Islands, northeast 15 for the Prince William Sound area, North Gulf Coast, east to northeast 20 to 30. Kodiak Island on Friday, northwest winds 25 to 30 knots, northwest at 15 for Bristol Bay. Alaska Peninsula, northwesterlies 20 to 30 knots. And for Saturday, swing it around to the southeast and south-southeast here for the peninsula, 25 to 30 knots, south at 20 for Bristol Bay, and west-southwest 25 for Kodiak Island. Eastern Aleutians, northwest winds 30 knots. Adak and Atka, west winds, or I should say eastern Aleutians northwest winds at 30 knots. Westerly gales for Adak and Atka at sustained at 40 knots with seas 10 feet. And storm warnings there from Kiska to Shimia, southeast winds 50 knots. And then for the day on Saturday, gale force winds here for the central and western Aleutians from the southwest at 35 to 45 knots. And for the eastern Aleutians, south to southwest winds at 30 knots. And for the southwest coast, Yukon Delta coastline here, north at 25. The same thing for St. Matthew Island, a little stronger for the Pribilofs, northwest at 30. Then back down to 20 knots out of the northwest for the Kuskokwim Delta coast, St. Lawrence Island and Norton Sound, north winds 20 knots. And then for the day on Saturday, see that front really bringing the winds up here into the Bering Sea, southeast 40 for the Pribilofs, east 45 for St. Matthew Island, and 25 knots for the Kuskokwim Delta coast, diminishing to 20 knots along the Yukon Delta coast, St. Lawrence Island, east at 15. And for the Chukchi Sea tomorrow, brisk wind advisories, north at 25 knots there, northwest 15 for the western Arctic coast, central coast, light southwest breeze at 10 knots. And still looking at some gale force winds for the far eastern Beaufort Sea coast through tomorrow. And then that actually continues into Saturday as well there, Kaktovik Barter Island to Demarcation Point, gale warnings for east winds at 35 knots, much lighter just to the west there, and light and variable here for the central coast at 5 knots, and the Chukchi Sea looking at north winds at about 20 knots.